Good evening and welcome to Building Futures, Habitat Charlotte Region's 6th Annual Affordable Housing Symposium. I'm Laura Belcher, President and CEO of Habitat for Humanity of the Charlotte region, and I'm so glad to be with you tonight. While I truly miss seeing you in the audience and feeling the energy in the room, especially at this time, we know that for our safety, your safety, our speaker safeties, we're running this evening's event virtually. So thanks for being with us in the digital space instead of the Halton Theater. So much has transpired in the last 12 months. Our country is simply not the same as it was a year ago. From the pandemic's devastating toll on human life, to horrifying acts of racial violence, to an election resulting in a deeply divided nation. It would be easy to simply give up, but that's not in our DNA at Habitat. Instead, we rise to the face of challenges, taking a stand to support those in need. This includes families most negatively impacted by COVID right now, and those that have suffered through discriminatory practices and policies throughout our country's history. We feel it's important to take a firm stand against racial injustice and to continue to advocate for fair, decent, affordable housing for all. Tonight, you'll learn how a history of financial policies and banking regulations has resulted in a massive wealth disparity between Black and white families in America. Our nation's historic reliance on homeownership for wealth building has exacerbated the racial wealth gap. The median white family has 8 times the wealth of the median Black family and 5 times the wealth of the median Latino or Hispanic family. Still surprising, the homeownership gap between white and Black Americans is larger today than it was 50 years ago. In our area, 72% of white families are homeowners, while only 42% of Black families are homeowners. We still have work to do. At Habitat, we remain committed to helping the underserved and creating solutions that address permanent affordability for generations. Last year, 94% of the people that we partnered with through Habitat Charlotte Region's programs were people of color. And we're going to continue to lend our voice and to advocate to increase the supply and the preservation of affordable homes, advocate for ways to equitably increase access to credit, optimizing land use for affordable homes, and ensuring access to and development of communities of opportunity. We hope the information presented this evening provides clear insight into how we've become such a wealth-divided nation. More importantly, we hope that it spurs you into action, that it inspires you, and that you become engaged in addressing these difficult racial challenges. I'd like to mention Habitat Charlotte Region's Beloved Community Initiative. Beloved Community is a framework that ensures that we position racial justice and diversity, equity, inclusion in the center of our work and our community events like tonight's Building Futures. We believe in a world where everyone deserves a chance for a better future, regardless who they are, what they look like, or where they come from. We build these opportunities through affordable home ownership, through critical home repairs, and through financial education. Partnering with like-minded believers, Habitat creates stable homes and improved communities where families build self-sufficiency, improve their financial incomes, and live better lives. Now, before I introduce tonight's keynote speaker, I want to recognize Lowe's, a longtime Habitat Charlotte Region supporter and this year's Building Futures sponsor. This week officially kicks off International Women Build Week. Since 2008, Lowe's and Habitat have partnered on International Build Week that has resulted in builds and build efforts for women and women-led head of households across the country and around the world. Tonight, I'd also like to highlight Lowe's Inspiration Challenge. It's a fundraiser where Lowe's will match every online gift supporting women build up to $30,000. I want to encourage you tonight to think about how you might participate in this challenge, and I'll give you more details on how to do that as we close out the show. And now I'd like to offer a warm welcome to Mirza Badaran and thank her for being with us tonight. She is a law professor from UC Irvine, a U.S. banking expert, and an accomplished author. Her recent book, The Color of Money, explores the racial wealth gap that currently exists in our nation and analyzes its historical roots in the Black banking system. Mirza, thank you for being here with us tonight at Building Futures, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. It is an honor to be here. Habitat is an organization that is very dear to my heart. I worked in Habitat for my 4 years of college, and I was the president of the Habitat for Humanity community in my college back in the 90s. But I have continued to be a huge admirer of your mission and the work that you've done. So the book is about the racial wealth gap, and I want to give a brief overview and then really talk about the housing aspect of the racial wealth gap. I encourage you all to read the parts that come before what I'm going to skip to right now, but to get a full sort of flavor of how this racial wealth gap was created. But let me just start with some statistics here. Great. So I want to show the roles of credit policies, economic theories, and banks. The role of those institutions and housing has also played in perpetuating the racial wealth gap. So as you see from these statistics, it doesn't diminish with college degrees. So it's not, this is not an education gap. It is very much a gap of wealth that goes actually higher the more higher income people get. And so wealth as separated from income is an indicator that is about, the community that you live in. It is about the access to the resources and the sort of social capital that you accumulate. All of that comes down to housing. Housing is where the vast majority of middle-class wealth is stored, and it is where that gap is able to self-perpetuate because of the history of segregation. So it's also the case that our policies to eradicate the racial wealth gap have not diminished it over time. So post-Civil War, the share of Black wealth in the country was about 0.5%. Today, that's about 1 to 1.5%. So to say that our public policy efforts to eradicate the wealth gap has been a total failure is an absolute understatement. And it is the myths that we tell about markets that I believe present the biggest obstacles to closing the racial wealth gap and achieving economic justice. So I'll get through some of those myths, but the first and most important is the promise of the market that we have, which we all believe to be, free market capitalism. And the idea of free market capitalism is that it does not discriminate. That free markets offer equal opportunity to all to trade and to prosper based on one's skill and ability to produce. So a lot of this comes back to what can we own? You have the property, and your skill, your income leads to wealth, and that wealth can be used for more wealth. But history reveals that either the fact is that markets do discriminate, or alternatively, that the American economy has not borne any resemblance to a free market. And I try to make the case for the latter. For most of our history, Black men and women have been excluded from occupations, schools, neighborhoods, housing, and trades. And this is the most crucial thing, is that their property, their homes, were not protected by law. They were not able to live where they wanted to live or get the land, the farms, whatever the vehicle for equity and middle-class wealth was not available to Black communities. And in each historical moment where wealth was being created in America, it was through land or housing. So it was through the Homestead Act, the FHA mortgage credit loan. And in each of these moments, Black communities were shut out of that wealth communication. And at certain pivot points in history, and I talk in the book about several, but I want to gloss over two today, mostly Reconstruction, the New Deal, and the Civil Rights era, where there was state intervention and capital being allocated. Yet the rhetoric of free market capitalism was used to prevent Black men and women, and specifically Black homes, from being able to access this capital and this wealth creation. Instead of reform, the Black community was offered a self-help market of segregated banks and businesses. In other words, the leaders upholding the white market institutions promised that the market would fix the problems that were created by law and backed by violence. So in the quick history that follows, I want to start with Reconstruction and talk about how, the story of slavery, enslavement. We talk about, can you switch the slide, please? Sorry, I'm not in control of the slide, so thank you. I'll just maybe say next. No, but back, sorry. I'm just, can you go back to the dollar bill? Go back, please. Thank you. Forward, one forward. The history of Reconstruction is, the history of enslavement, when it is told, is about the extraction of labor from the sort of property in man. And the more accurate version of enslavement was that it was the labor extraction, it was the growing cotton, but it was also that men and women who were enslaved were themselves capital. They were property owned by their slave holders, who were able to use that capital to build more wealth, to use it as collateral, to use it as leverage. There's, ways in which men and women who were enslaved were sold through lines that were not quite, real property and not quite chattel, but very specific legal distinctions for how these men and women were valued as during the time of enslavement. So that capital and that property in man was the real basis of the Confederate currency. And when the Civil War was fought, it was fought over land, and it was fought over slavery, but it was also about what system of currency would dominate. So freedmen and their abolitionist allies demanded land as a form of reparations, and as punishment, of course, for the treasonous Confederates. Without land, they reasoned, freedom and justice would be meaningless, and participation in capitalism would be a farce. So you all understand this as, providers of home. When people own a home, when people feel safe in their own shelter, there is a more participatory structure in the community, in the economy. And so the idea was to, break up the land holdings of the South and offer, the meal was, just a thing that got added on, it was really about the land and the autonomy to be able to grow your own land and feed your family. Of course, President Johnson vetoed the land grant bill and the Freedmen's Bill, and he reasoned that freedmen would be protected by the free market and by contract law, that they would just bargain for fair wages and buy their own land. And this was either unbelievably naive or incredibly cynical. At the time, the Southern economy was nothing like a free market. Whites refused to sell property to Blacks, to Black men and women. Southern legislators, lawyers, and judges drafted laws governing every aspect of labor. They restricted Black men and women from skilled trades. Vagrancy laws were prevalent, and wages were capped by law and by cabal between employers. Violations led to convict labor without due process. So by the end of Reconstruction, most freedmen were left landless, voteless, and with practically every profession blocked to them. Their only choice was to grow cotton. Of course, that was the whole point. Cotton was the most valuable commodity, fueling not just the Southern economy, but the Northern industrial economy and the Liverpool sort of cotton merchants. And the threat after the Civil War, if Black men and women were able to get land and control their own property, that they would grow less cotton. That's what had happened in Haiti when the Haitian Revolution led to land allocation. And the Haitians, did what any landholder would do, which is if you have land, you grow a little bit of that crop to feed your family, subsistence crop, and then you grow a little bit of it, maybe a minority, maybe half, depending on the market, as a cash crop to gain wages. And that was the fear driving the push against giving freedmen land. It was driven by a market need for low commodity prices in cotton. And of course, it wasn't, laissez-faire economics. It was a re-subversion of sort of oppression of Black men and women to grow cotton, and a legal system deployed for to get that outcome. In fact, W.E. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction talks about the entire point of the police in the South during that time of sharecropping was to police labor, was to make sure that you were just growing cotton on your tract of land, and if you were doing anything else, it was considered vagrancy. So of course, the one provision that lasts through the Freedmen's Bill is the Freedmen's Bank, and there was branches all over the South. It accrued $75 million in deposits, which is about $1.5 billion today. The idea here was that instead of land, the right way to earn property, to buy land, instead of sort of receiving it as a gift, these are quotes, you would earn it, right? Never mind that hundreds of years of labor on the land wasn't earning it. You were going to get a bank account. And of course, this bank account, it wasn't a commercial bank. It wasn't that you would get a mortgage from this bank. It was just a glorified piggy bank that would safeguard the deposits of the freedmen and women. And the reason why this bank was so successful, and it was embraced by the freedmen, and by the way, the Irish also, who were also deemed to be a lesser race and were not allowed to have bank accounts. So some Irishmen, men and women, had accounts at these banks, and it was open to all, women and men, was because the insignia of the bank had the pictures of Grant and Sherman and Lincoln and, all of the sort of the Union, not just the Union heroes, but also the flag, the American flag, and the Treasury imprimatur. And the way that these bills were advertised was that they were connected to the federal government. The spoiler is that they were never connected to the federal government. It was just a bank. That capital was not backed by the full faith and credit of the Treasury. And this mattered hugely because at the time, there was no FDIC insurance. And the way that bank notes were judged was deemed, their value was deemed connected to the bank that issued the note. So if you were JP Morgan and you issued a $100 note, that would be worth $100 because you're JP Morgan and you're good for it. If you were some random bank in, rural Georgia, you issued a $100 note, it would be discounted because maybe you wouldn't be there when the person, the note holder, went to go pick it up. So all of these funds, because this bank was signed into law by Congress, were people trusted the bank that they would hold this money. But of course, the white manager of the bank was named Henry Cook. His brother was infamous Wall Street speculator Jay Cook, who took that $1.5 billion in today's money and speculated it away in railroad bonds, which was the subprime market of today. Think about like GameStop, right? It was that. Thought he would win big. He lost half of the deposits. And the failure of this bank really shocked the depositors. I mean, as it, these were very hard-earned wages. And W.E. Du Bois says that not even 10 additional years of slavery could have done so much as to throttle the thrift thrift. Can I get the next slide? I think it's on there. The thrift of the freedmen as the mismanagement and bankruptcy of the Freedmen's Bank. And the tragedy was that by the time the Freedmen's Bank failed, the disenfranchisement of the Black community was complete. The rights written into the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were basically taken away by legislators, courts, police power, and the paramilitary violence of the Klan. They were left, sort of without a vote and in a very oppressive system of sharecropping. And the Supreme Court kept eroding the rights even further. So the 14th Amendment for the next century, the amendment that was supposed to protect Black men and women from the hostile arm of the state, was actually used more to protect corporations against state regulation than it was people against the law. So this is the era of heavy Jim Crow. I'll skip through it fast, except to say just one happy moment here in the next slide. A lot of the banks that were built during this time were like Maggie Walker's bank. Maggie Walker was the first. I said Women's History Month is on the dawn of Black History Month. There's many heroic Black bankers during this time that I cover in the book, but she was probably the most brilliant, successful, and heroic of them all. She was the first woman of any bank, first woman of any race, to own a bank. She was the first Black banker inducted into the Virginia Bankers Association, which was, a huge honor. And her bank was very successful. She initially started the bank, as many banks in the South were started like hers. They were meant to meet the needs of people in a heavy Jim Crow South. So there were burial funds, there were insurance, there were schools, they were connected with a church or a social group or society of some sort. And hers was to help women gain their financial independence. And so she had this bank, but she was also a very good banker. She was very successful. And during the Great Depression, she was able to merge actually several other Black banks into her bank and provide liquidity and really save a bunch of other banks. Her bank actually tragically survives the Great Depression very successfully, but is taken down by the 2008 financial crisis. Obviously, she had passed on long before, but her bank lasted until the 2008 crisis wiped out so many community banks. And then you have the sort of Great Migration north, and I'll cover this part quickly, but as millions of Black men and women migrate up north. They're met with segregation in the north. They're both escaping the Southern Jim Crow society, also the economic collapse of the cotton market, and being brought up north, like everyone was at the time. Immigrants across the world were coming for the jobs, right? The Industrial Revolution was picking up, and so they moved into these northern cities. And this was the heyday of Black-owned banks. One of the bankers was Jesse Binga, whose bank was emblematic of some of the commercial banks during this time. He's on the next slide. Jesse Binga, started as a realtor. He kept buying a nice house in a nice white neighborhood, and his house got bombed about 10 times. And he kept moving back into that neighborhood because he said, I'm, American. I have the right to live wherever I want. But these were the constraints on Black men and women in the North. Is that the North sort of invented housing segregation, and it really did it at first with violence, with coercion, and then later on it got more sophisticated. But for many years, these neighborhoods were churning, and they would tip over from being white families or immigrant communities, and then the first few Black families would move in, pay a premium on the homes, and then the market would plummet. And so these home values never retained their equity. And this is one of the main drivers of the racial wealth gap, because it still extends to today. Homes in Black communities don't gain in value. Some of them don't gain in value at all by nature of being owned by Black men and women in Black communities. There's even examples of appraisers coming in and looking at homes in a mixed race community, but if you know that it's a Black person and there's pictures on the wall, the appraiser comes in at $100,000 less than it would with the replacement. And there's been many recent studies on this, and by recent I mean 2020, not 1930. Okay, so then I'm going to go through the main driver of housing segregation in this era, and that's the New Deal. And the New Deal really radically changed the entire housing market. It created the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. It ensured safety in banking. I joke in my class about 363 banking. That was what we did from the New Deal until about the 1970s. But deposits get 3%, loans get 6%, you 6% on loans, 3% on deposits, so 3, 6, and then you're on the golf course by 3 p.m. because there's no risk in banking. You're printing money. Hundreds of thousands of banks are created during this time to just funnel essentially FHA mortgages. The loans are guaranteed by the FHA. The deposits are guaranteed by the FDIC. There's laws about how much you can charge on both. And this is why banks were giving out toasters and umbrellas, because they couldn't offer good interest rates until those got deregulated. It was also made possible by this massive government insurance fund for mortgages and the creation of this very stable, very profitable for everyone involved mortgage. And it was based on racial segregation. So the next slide shows a typical redlining map, and you can find, there's a great website called Mapping Inequality that has uploaded every single actual redlining map. This is an actual map of Chicago. You can get them of any city in the country right now, and you can actually see the metrics used to determine the elaborate questionnaires that they use to determine the risk profile of every neighborhood. So, of course, green, blue it's okay. The FHA can guarantee it. Yellow was iffy. And red is redlined, high risk. They will not guarantee a loan in that community. And of course, the number one metric that they used was the racial makeup of the community. And you can see it, I've looked at basically all these maps I could get my hands on. And some of them will just say, this is a Black neighborhood. They'll say, Negro, they'll say Mexican, they'll say, low class German or whatever. Sometimes they'll say there's too many subversive races. I don't know what subversive races means, or say racially unharmonious. Sometimes they use pseudonyms, but it's very clear what they're getting at. So the next map here, the next slide is a actual map this is Atlanta, Georgia area. And that area that I've marked right there is where Morehouse and Spelman and Atlanta University at the time were. This, if it were a white neighborhood, it would have been a very highly desirable neighborhood because it was single family homes. That is the highest metric for the HOLC map makers. There were homes that were owned, there were parks, and there were universities, and there were business class workers, right? Clerical business class. It wasn't, there wasn't industrial workers. But you see number 2 here, the characteristics, inhabitants, you see, occupation. So fine. Then it says foreign-born families, 0%. So what foreign-born is, immigrants. And then Negro, yes, 100%. Infiltration of. So how close how likely is it that this neighborhood will be infiltrated by, and think about that language, infiltrated by these other less desirable races. And of course, this neighborhood is redlined, which means that for the next 50 years, they do not get an FHA mortgage, which essentially means they did not get a mortgage. So I have looked at the private financing of these. There was no private financing. 99% of the financing for mortgages came with an FHA guarantee. They still do. It is a market where it's not only guaranteed, but then there's a secondary market where if you get an FHA loan, you can sell it up to the secondary market. So banks were just pumping out these loans and selling them and getting them off their books. For Black banks, if you want to lend into a Black community that's redlined, you're going to go without that FHA guarantee, and you also have to hold on to that risks, all that risk yourself. So if that mortgage defaults, that's your money. So very few banks were able to do this. Some were, many weren't. So this also comes attached to a consumer credit bifurcation as well. So in the white sort of suburbs that are building equity and homeownership, the kids are going to have parks, there's schools, all these suburbs sort of come out of nowhere, right? This is the Levittown. This is the sort of era when America was great, where people had bowling alleys and there was community and everything was safe, was built on the basis of that heavy state segregation. And in the cities, what had happened was the businesses had left, the infrastructure was not being updated. As people were moving out of the city into the suburbs, roads were being bifurcating Black communities. So you see in Durham was a famous Black Wall Street, but when Durham became, experienced white flight, they built a highway right through that Black Wall Street that had been existing. This happened all across the country. Greenwood in Tulsa. It happened in New York. Robert Moses infamously cut up New York and made it a driver city. It is revived since, but not without much trouble. So this two different credit markets in the suburbs and in the city also created a revolving credit market in the suburbs, which was, credit cards, low interest rates, very flexible credit where you could buy a lot of consumer goods. This is what fueled the post-war boom. In the city, there's installment credit. Installment credit is sort of night and day from revolving credit. Installment credit is where it's like a rent-a-center. It's a payday loan where you go buy, and it's the only option available, right? You go and you buy everything bundled together, and if you miss a payment, you lose the whole bundle, and you're paying 10 times as much for the same amount of goods, not counting the interest. The interest then, is much higher. So this is where the seeds of the civil rights movement stemmed from, the fights that many community groups, and this is, I think, a really inspirational story that gets forgotten when we just start with Martin Luther King, which Martin Luther King also started with a boycott. But his boycott was inspired by some of the early boycotts in these northern cities of these installment lenders and these stores. And these boycotts, started in the 30s and in the 40s. And successful sort of mothers groups and, Adam Clayton Powell, organized workers in Harlem and in Detroit and other places where there were real coordinated action. And early on in the 1930s, and I write about this in one of the chapters of my book, there's this case by one of these stores that took these boycotters to court and says, it's unconstitutional. You can't not shop here. You can't boycott us. That's not, that's a violation of our rights, right? We're being canceled. And the court actually sided with the boycotters and said, it is perfectly people's right to boycott you and to protest your discrimination. And this is appropriate. And so, of course, that's what, inspired Martin Luther King and the Montgomery bus boycott, and then everything that followed after that. So I want to quickly, maybe I'll stop here for questions and not go to the later bit, but let me just kind of get us from the New Deal to today. Let me just show the next two slides. The way that this, so first it was the signs, this is how segregation worked, but then it was through these racial covenants that were in every deed in every house for many years. So you see this, this property shall not be to any person not white or of the Caucasian race. This was a covenant that was sold with every house until the 1970s when it was no longer enforced. But you can still find these in your deeds. They're not enforceable, of course, by court starting in the 70s. But this is how the lawyers and the courts were able to enforce segregation. The next one shows respectable white people. My home in Athens, Georgia had, you see, it shall not be other than respectable white people. That said, lot shall not be sold to any person not of Caucasian race. So there's various versions of this, but this was standard practice. HOA, homeowners associations were early on started to enforce racial covenants. This was all about property values, because the second your neighborhood tipped, it wasn't just your racism that didn't want Black neighbors. It was also the fears of losing your home values. And this is the way that the wealth gap is created and perpetuated. Because once we had the civil rights movement, all the civil rights laws, as monumental as they were, voting rights law, civil rights law, they just got us back to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Equal protection, due process, voting was guaranteed from the beginning. I mean, it should have been guaranteed when the Constitution was written. It was not, but it certainly was in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And so the civil rights laws said, okay, now we're sending federal troops, and we're still actually struggling on that account. But what it didn't do ever is to undo these systems of segregation. And there have been efforts, and I show in the book what those efforts have been, but really they've been about Nixonian Black capitalism that is now sort of opportunity zones and the idea that all these segregated communities need is just loans and entrepreneurs and more businesses, and without actually tackling that this was a policy. This was a government policy enforced at every level, federal, state, local, and also through the courts, through the legislatures, through the Federal Reserve, through the FHA, through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Every institution was involved. And now we're saying, okay, the market will fix the problem that law and policy created. So I will just end before I take questions with just, we can't deflect the responsibility of the racial wealth gap and economic inequality onto the Black community. They didn't cause this problem. This is not a responsibility this is not a result of bad choices or not saving enough or not, working hard enough. This was a choice of policy over and over again throughout history. W. Du Bois declared in 1948 that the great problem of American democracy was that it had not yet been tried. So, this is a ode to democracy, and that perhaps we can try by including our fellow Americans in the promise of democracy. And I will take some questions in the remaining time.
That's great. That's great. Marissa, thanks so much for that information, that context. There's a lot to unpack in that. And so I do want to transition us into conversation, and I want to bring Natasha Reed Rice into the conversation with us as well. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then I invite folks on the line to put your questions in the chat box, and we'll get those teed up as well. But Natasha is joining us. Natasha Reed Rice is the Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for Habitat for Humanity International. And she's got a strong background with Habitat, having been with the organization since 2011, working in real estate and legal and finance. And so I'm glad that she's here and has recently taken on this new role as the Global DE&I Officer. And so I'm going to start with Natasha to kind of reflect a little bit on what you heard from Marissa and put it in a Habitat context maybe. And can you share with our audience, kind of what are your top priorities? What are Habitat's priorities as we focus right now on racial wealth gaps?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, Laura, to this conversation. Thank you, Marissa. I have pages and pages of notes. This is not new history, which I think Marissa would acknowledge. It's just fascinating. It's not new. I mean, from the work that Marissa has brought forth to the work that Richard Rothstein is bringing out, that many other social scholars and historians are bringing out. What I love about this moment is the fact that what's new. And thankfully, we're doing so because it is essential to recovering from these multiple pandemics. It's essential to, as Du Bois said in 48, testing our democracy and creating what the future that we want to see in this country, right? So what excites me, Laura, about focusing in intentionally on diversity, equity, and inclusion within the Habitat context are a few things. One is that when we talk about the title of my new role, diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're really not talking about a title. We're not talking about a concept. We're talking about doing the work that we're called to do throughout the world, and particularly in the U.S. context, from a theological imperative as a Christian organization, from a historical imperative. I mean, Habitat, as many of you know, was founded in a very divisive context in Americus, Georgia. So divisive that Dr. King and Andy Young and others wouldn't even go during the Civil Rights Movement. So we come from a historical reality that was very bold and courageous in its time. And I think that compels us to be that way today. When we talk about equity, and diversity and inclusion, it is so much more than the work that we're doing in our internal staff and the work that we're doing with courageous conversations. All of that is important and necessary, but it is really transformational work in this context of a housing sector that has over and over again been rife with equity disparities. I think that what we just heard Marissa talk about that's so important is that gap that we see. A lot of us like to say, oh, well, back in the 60s. Well, no, the reality is that the Kerner Commission report in 1968 that we live in two Americas, divided, one equal, separate and unequal, is a reality, unfortunately, that many people live in today. Right? The Kerner Commission said we live in two Americas, one black and one white. that can actually be said today. Those maps that Marissa shared with us of the redlining communities, if we overlay those today into many communities around the country that we as Habitat serve, we'll see some of the same patterns. What we're seeing today also is the playing out of what happened in this with this segregated reality. And as Marissa said, the burden is not on these Black and brown families that people wag their finger at and say that they don't have financial character, that they don't have fortitude or resilience. No, what they're really seeing is what happens when you strip certain populations of the opportunity to build wealth and equity. And you do so with such a profound and powerful systemic policy to those families for generations to come. So when we look at the history that Marissa just pointed out, and also I also like to point out in these conversations, there's quite a bit of controversy about how we redress this racial segregation. And many folks are like, straps. You know, we hear that type of language a lot. We talk about individual responsibility when the folks that are often talking about that individual responsibility are standing on the shoulders of government policy that has allowed their family to get them to that place. So in addition to the history that Marissa has shared, we have to look at our context that we serve within Habitat. And one such aspect of that is something like the GI Bill, right? The GI Bill helped those white vets returning from World War II afford a mortgage in areas and communities that eventually were appreciating context. So their equity grew in those homes. That same benefit was not afforded to African American families. And I always like to point that out because what is that saying? That GI Bill, that government policy and program was a government subsidy that created the white middle class. We've done that as a country. We have created a white middle class before. We have created a middle class. We have recovered from World War II as a result of that. So generation after generation, those folks that descended from those folks who received the benefit of the GI Bill, when they lost their job in 2008, they had equity to fall back on. When they had healthcare crises, they had equity to fall back on. Their children could go to school without massive debt. When we talk about student debt and the families that we're trying to serve throughout the Habitat Network, that's more of a it's not just a conversation about how many loans they took out for college. Why those loans? Why do they need them? Because their parents didn't have access to equity in their homes, right? So all of these things tie together. I'm excited for this conversation, Laura, because when we talk about equity and we talk about housing, we talk about the work of Habitat vacuum. We cannot just talk about the Habitat, bring about the housing sector realities and contexts. We also can't talk about it without realizing the intersections being played out vividly in front of our very eyes with COVID-19. It is impacting communities of color disproportionately because many of those communities don't live in decent, affordable, safe, environmentally sound communities. We have to begin to continue to unpack that, and that means to do the equity work. And I'll end on this part, Laura, in that I want to highlight a point that Marissa made also. The civil rights movement halted at housing. It didn't have the ability to transform it at the time. I truly believe to real estate and to housing is because I believe this is the next frontier of the civil rights movement. This is the next frontier where we test our democracy and build the communities where we truly love our neighbors as ourselves. We bridge across differences and we find a way to make this country become all that it was created to be.
Marissa, I want to play off of what Natasha was just talking about and teeing up. Both of you have done a great job of putting the context of history of how we got to where we are. And now I want to really try and focus on what do we need to do different, right? So Marissa, Charlotte is a city, institutions, a banking city, and we're also a can city, and so we want to do things different and better. So what are the policy things that you think we should be thinking about that we could be doing to change things for low-income families of color?
That's a great question. Sorry, I put it on mute because there was dogs and children barking and crying out there. So I actually, after I wrote the book, I didn't want to give sort of easy solutions to this because this is a racial wealth gap. It's a discriminatory thing, and Natasha was dead on in the ways that we've blamed communities for the systems that have caused their problems. This is not a problem of choices. I think, but because the racial wealth gap was created across so many different sectors, it was such a holistic creation that it really needs a full-on, we need, like, I'm glad that you brought up the Kerner Commission, because the Kerner Commission was the closest American society got to like a truth and reconciliation and a reparations program, to say, look what we did, look what we justified. Here are some of the myths that we use, because we end these programs. You end Jim Crow, kind of, you end slavery, kind of, but then you don't talk about, hey, remember how we said for hundreds of years that, God deemed the white man to be the master of the black man? And then when that went away, we said that there was some like Darwinian scientific reason for racial superiority. And then we just kind of threw that away. And now we're on this other thing, but we never look at those myths and say, we made that up because we needed cheap cotton, and we had the weapons, and we exploited people, and we did violence to them, and we deprived them of their autonomy because we wanted cheap cotton. And we made up this stuff about race because we needed that. Okay. So those are the things that we need to just sit together and handle. We just need to deal with this history, because, one of the most tragic things is to see this debunked stuff come up again. I mean, it doesn't go away when you don't deal with it head on. And the Kerner Commission, I think, was one moment where we said, white society created the Black ghetto. White society condones it. White society is implicated. Like, you have blood on your hands. Deal with it. And we didn't, because the next year it was Richard Nixon in the White House who said, it's not your problem, law and order, personal responsibility. And then we moved into the Reagan area. So I think the end, what we need to get to is truth and reconciliation and reparations. I mean, looking at what the Nazis did during the post-Nazi, the Germans did with the Nuremberg trials,
right?
Is we will hunt and get every Nazi. We will make sure that this ideology is dead forever in Germany. It is not acceptable. There's no free speech when it comes to Nazis. It's over. You are out of polite society and out of society, period. South Africa with apartheid. I mean, still so much work to do, but really we're going to have trials, and we're going to put people up. I think we're well past enslavement. We're not that far past the New Deal era FHA stuff, but just real truth and reconciliation and reparations, damages. Then I think, but I think on the practical point, there are some things that cities and states could do. And I did take my hand at one possibility. I talked about the Homestead Act. It's called the 21st Century Homestead Act. I wrote up the financing. It can be done locally, statewide. This is a way, just housing wise, to get financing in areas where there are a lot of homes where the markets are broken. So Baltimore, maybe there are places in Charlotte around this formerly redlined areas where the prices, where there's been before gentrification happens, where there is a housing stock, to take that on like a land trust would, but with equity. You buy up those homes with the city and some federal financing and some HUD, FHA help, just like the initial New Deal. You grant these to homeowners in that area, formerly redlined, Black and brown communities, and then you do it with the development loan. So then you're paying what you wouldn't rent or what you would for Section 8, but this is your home that you own, just like what Habitat does. Financing, I've kind of put down to paper just to how to get the Federal Reserve, the way that the Federal Reserve does these liquidity facilities, emergency funds that they send to Wall Street and the commercial paper market. They could do it to municipalities. They could do it to cities. You would apply for a grant. I propose this. I hope that it's something that I'm working right now with some folks that I know inside the administration to try to get something like this running. And I would hope that some cities like Charlotte or other places would say, yeah, we want to do this, get the funding, redevelop the homes, find the grantees, and then wait 10 years. And then you have, equity and outright home ownership and a revived area. And you've done it, everyone benefits. That's the magic of sort of, what the FHA was able to do.
Yeah.
And I think what we could do again.
Well, Marissa, I think, from a policy be done, federal, state, local levels. And then Natasha, one of the things that I got some questions but before we were putting things together around kind of what's the grassroots opportunity to address the racial wealth gap?
Yeah, I think there are a few things. It's interesting. Marissa mentioned one such thing. When we look at the racially restrictive covenants, I'll go from granular to bigger. When we look at, we reference the racially restrictive covenant issue, many local organizing groups are working to remove those racial restrictions from the racial covenants from their deeds. I mean, because as Marissa's
I think we may have lost Natasha. All right. Well, while we try and get Natasha back, Marissa, I might ask you another question. Just, as you look at, are you seeing anybody doing something creative or innovative in this space that we could be learning from?
Yeah. So my Homestead Act, I cited a couple of places where I've seen similar actions, right? Public, broadband as a public, option, as an effort in several communities that has really brought jobs and housing help. I think things like that are sort of municipal public programs. Savannah, Georgia, to the port. You have several cities. I based my Homestead Act on the New York City, what they did with some of the properties that they had in tax arrears. As a Mitchell Lama program, there's a couple others where they took those properties that were, unpaid taxes, that were just kind of like they had land banked, and then redeveloped them and, did grants. They did it through a developer, and there was lots of profits, but there's a way to do it where those properties can be used to close the racial wealth gap, and the redevelopment can be done holistically. Baltimore, I talk about this in the Homestead Act too, did a $1 for homes program, but the problem there was that there was no financing for development. So they would give the home away for $1, but you couldn't get anyone to lend you the money for the redevelopment because the value of the home was lower than the loan needed to redevelop. And so that's why you need to have a financing mechanism. You need to have a partner who's willing to put in the financing across a variety of different properties, because you can't just develop one in a blighted neighborhood, because those property values will never get the appraisals that they need.
Yeah. Good. Question from the audience real quick. Do you have any thoughts on the opportunity zones? Are those working out the way that you might have hoped in order to address low-income neighborhoods and bringing affordable housing to bear?
I did a New York Times op-ed on opportunity zones early on. And what I will say is it's a program based in Nixon's Black capitalism. It's tax cuts. It is for capital holders. I do think that some good projects could stem from this. Jobs could be brought in. Revitalization could certainly happen. But the primary capital benefits go to developers and investors, and they come through tax cuts. And so this is not a program designed for home ownership for just people.
Yeah.
And now it could down the line lead to that, but that's not what the design was.
Yeah. Looking at it ourselves and trying to figure out if there's an opportunity for habitat in opportunity zones, we're having a hard time finding how that might intersect with what we're trying to do. So we remain optimistic, but challenged by those. I am sensitive to time, and I know that we're getting late, at least on the East Coast. Marissa, it's a little bit earlier for you, but we've had some good questions, and I really appreciate the time that you've been able to spend with us. So I would ask if Natasha or Marissa, if you have any closing advice or comments that you want to share with the group before we close out tonight, I'd invite each of you to make a closing comment.
I will leave the time to Natasha because she didn't get to finish her statement, but I feel like I've been talking for long enough.
Well, thank you, Laura. Can you all hear me now? I'm sorry.
We can.
Okay, great. So thank you, and thank you, Mirza. I learned quite a bit, and feel like I have these conversations and do this reading all the time, and I just feel like you shed great light and insight on this topic. I'll close by saying, one, connect with Habitat Charlotte. If you have not already, Habitat Charlotte is working on some great solutions, and that's what I was getting ready to go into. The source of income conversation, the source of income discrimination piece is a very big issue. When we begin looking now at the recovery bill, close to $10 billion have been set aside for foreclosure prevention and mortgage assistance. Find ways to tap into that, as well as you look around in your local areas. So much of real estate, so much of housing is local. So finding ways to connect to those folks that run and set policy at the local level and the state level, let your voice be heard. And hopefully we'll be able to partner with you as we continue to face the truth of our context. And I love that part that Mirza brought up, is that we really oftentimes deny the truth. Let's stop explaining away the truth. Let's deal with it. If COVID has taught us anything, we realize that there are communities, and particularly communities of color, that suffer more, not just from COVID, but from many of the other issues that impact our communities, impact our health, our education, and so many other aspects. So how do we stabilize our communities? We begin to really deal with the reality and the context, stop guilting it away, and jump in the ring, and let's work together to make a difference. So thank you again, Laura, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation.
Thrilled to have you. Really, major thanks again to Mirza and to Natasha for both of you being here to elevate this conversation, to challenge the audience. I really do appreciate it. This is the month of women's history, and so having two outstanding women on the panel has been great. Do appreciate you being here, and thank you. This is our 6th Building Futures event, and so we are glad to be able to do that and host that for the community. As I mentioned at the top of the show, Lowe's is our sponsor of tonight's event and generously has provided a $30,000 inspiration grant, a challenge grant. And so want to invite anybody in the audience that is able to participate. We would love to be able to meet and fully utilize that $30,000 challenge. We have to date raised over $7,500 towards that goal. We want to top out that goal in the next 24 hours. And so invite you, the information should be on the screen for ways you can donate at our website, habitatcltregion.org/inspire, or text INSPIRE 2021 to the number on your screen. Your support is really valued, and matching that challenge gift from Lowe's would be really a great way to cap out tonight. So really glad to have all of you here, and Natasha and Mirza were so gracious with their time and inspiring with their words. And so I hope to see you all again soon, if hopefully maybe on a job site soon and in person. So with that, I will wish you a good night. Thank you for your support and for your participation. Take care.